one of the main things that it talked about was, what are these guidelines? And the acronym is uh, WCAG, but these are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And I've included the link here, but just to kind of, if you can kind of keep that acronym, memorized, you can do a quick search for it. So, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, it pops up. Um, but this w3.org is is actually the site that you'll also use to like plug in your code. You can actually copy and paste your website hyperlink into it to test how accessible it is. So W3, in other words, W3.org is kind of a really important site in terms of accessibility. So keep that in mind. So with a quick Google, you have kind of, okay, how do you meet the current standards, and um, it provides resources for that. So we'll kind of be exploring those in more detail as you actually create your site. But for now, we're going to, as a group, um, create kind of a list of the areas that we need to look for when coding with accessibility in mind. But there's basically, so that he said, there are four core principles. And I think this is really helpful for just kind of situating, okay, well, what do, there's going to be lots of specific things that you have to do in your coding to make it accessible, but it's helpful to kind of take a step back and say, well, why are we doing this? And partly we're doing this because access to information is a human right. Um, it's not always perceived as that, and not everyone practices that, but it's kind of based on this belief that access to information is a human right. So partly it's about creating equal experiences for people with disabilities, and saying, why should their experiences with using the web be any less rich than someone without a disability. Um, but these four core principles are kind of helping us think about what are the actual goals of these standards. Like, what are they trying to, or what are they trying to do to our websites? And just to reiterate, you want your website to be perceivable. It's available through the senses, so like you can actually see it, for instance, or hear it if that's relevant to the maybe assistive device that you're using. Um, is it operable? Does it work? Understandable and robust? Can it be used um, by a variety of different assistive technologies? So there's a screen reader, and things like that. So in general, with accessibility, you need to think about it from the beginning of your project. Why? Because it's built into the code. So um, the other thing that you can do is to include people with disabilities in the user testing when possible. So even without having someone with a particular disability do a user test, in other words, so um, backing up for context, what is the user test? User test is basically when you're taking your website to a group of people and you're having them test it out. So you're getting multiple um, perspectives on how well it works. Um, and if you don't have someone, for instance, who has visual impairment to actually be part of that test group, um, there are other ways to do it. Like you can get, you know, find a screen reader yourself, or use a screen reader yourself instead. It's not ideal, but sometimes it's the best that you can do. So there's other ways to kind of create similar circumstances to test out what you're doing. and then to be transparent about your accessibility efforts. So um, this is part of thinking about how you want to frame yourself as someone who does web authoring, and also why it's valuable. And partly that's just thinking about, okay, how do I want to, here's the skill that I bring. But really, if we go back to thinking about access to information as a human right, you kind of have to um, think about how does this fit into your professional ethics and also your professional identity. So beyond how marketable this might make you, there's it kind of comes back to what do you actually believe in, um, and why is it important to you personally that you're designing things that are accessible to everyone and not just a privileged few, right? So you'll think about that later in the course when you actually develop your design philosophy, which is basically just a few sentences about how you understand design. Um, and so you'll be thinking about how does this, how does accessibility fit into your own design philosophy? Okay.